Okay then, so we have our two functions for the two separate requests sorted. One for get weather and one for get city, and they work in tandem because this one gets us the key code that we need to pass into this one to get the weather. So we have those two sorted now, and I'm going to come down to the bottom, and this stuff where we tested these out I'm going to now delete, because what I want to do now is actually hook up this form right here so that when a user types in some kind of location like Manchester or London or New York, we're going to take that value and we're going to make the request with that. So let's go now to our app.js, because this is where we're going to do all kinds of DOM manipulation and event handling. Forecast.js is for interacting with the APIs, and app.js is for DOM manipulation. So the first thing I want to do is get a handle on this form field right here. So if we go to index.html, we can see that this form right here has a class of change location. We could use that, or we could just grab the form because it's the only form on the page. So let's just do that. So over now in app.js, I'm going to say const, and we'll call it the city form, and make sure we have that correctly spelt, city form like that, and set it equal to document.query selector, and inside we want the form. Okay, so we have that reference now, and now what I want to do is add an event listener to that form, and the event is going to be a submit event, because when we type something into a form and then press enter, that is a submit event. So that's what we're listening for. So I'm going to now say city form.add events listener, and we want to add on the submit event. Let me just pop an I in there, and then we're going to fire a callback function which takes that event object, and inside the first thing I want to do is prevent default action, so it doesn't refresh the page. So I take the event object and use the prevent default method to do that. Now the next thing I want to do is actually spell this correctly for a start, default, and then the next thing I want to do is get the city value, so the thing that the user types in right here. So I'm going to store this in a constant. I'm going to say const city is now equal to city form. Then I'm going to get the city input by saying .city, and I can do that because the name of this input field is city. So let me now say .city to get that input field. Then I want the value of that, so we can say .value, and then I want to trim that just in case there's any white space. We don't want that. So now I have that value, and once I have that value, I can then reset the form so I can clear this out in case they want to change it in the future. So I can say city form.reset, and that's going to clear out the form fields. So let me just do a little comment above this to say what it is, and it's get city value. Now the last thing we need to do down here is actually update the UI with the new city. So we want to make a request to get the new city data and then eventually update what it looks like in the browser with that city information. Now what I'm going to do to get the data is externalize this into a separate function up here, then we'll call that function down here. So what I'm going to do is create a constant. I'm going to call this function update city because it's ultimately updating the city. Every time we type in a new value and press enter, that's getting a new city, right? So we'll call it update city. This is going to be an asynchronous function because inside this function, we're going to be calling, these two things right here, this function, and these are both asynchronous. So this is going to be asynchronous as well because it's going to take some time to complete. So this asynchronous function inside is going to then make a call to first of all get city and pass in the city value that a user typed in. Then it's going to call get weather with the ID, the city key, and get the weather information. So that first of all, we need to actually take the city in as a parameter. Then when we call it down here, we can say update city and pass in that city. Now it's this thing right here. That is what a user has typed in. So let me pass that in here. And then up here, we can access that city. So for now, let me just console.log the city just to make sure this is working and we have access to it. So at the minute, we're not doing any kind of calls to any APIs, and we're just literally attaching an event listener to this city form, listening for a submit, prevent the default action, get the city they type in, calling this update city function, and then logging it to the console. So let me test this. I'm just going to type in Manchester, and that works. New York, and that works. So this is all working. So now I can call these functions right here because we have a city. So instead of this, what I'll do is say const and then say city det for city details is going to be equal to await, and then we're going to call get city and pass in the city that we receive right here. Now, why am I doing it this way? Well, get city, this here is an asynchronous function, right? If we come to forecast.js and see get city, we can see it's an asynchronous function, and therefore it returns a promise. Now, since it returns a promise, we can use await to make sure that this is finished before we assign a value to city det, and that's what I'm doing. Because we need something from this to then make a request to get weather. So we'll wait until we get this value, then when we do, we can call the other one. So I'll say const weather is now equal to await, and then we're going to call get weather, which is the other function, and we're going to pass in city det.key. That is the key property from what we get back from this request. And by the way, I'm calling these functions right here from this file. Now I can do that because forecast.js defines those functions, and inside index.js, forecast comes before app.js. So by the time I'm calling them here, they're already defined above right here. So I can do that, even though they're in separate files. Okay then, so now we have these two things, and now we have the weather response, the thing we get back from this right here. And remember, that is this object that we return. It's an object about the weather. So what I'm going to do now is return a value from this function so that when we call that function over here, we can have a value returned to it. So I'm going to say return, and I'm going to return an object. Now inside this object, we're going to have two properties. I'm going to attach the city details and the weather. So I'll say city det is going to be city det. So we're calling the property city det, and the value is this thing right here. And we're going to do another property, which is the weather, and we're going to say that is equal to the weather as well. So both the property and the value is the same. The weather property is this, and we're returning this object now. So now when we call this, what's happening? Well, because this is an asynchronous function, it's returning a promise. We know that. So we can tack on a .then right here to say, okay, well, when this promise is resolved, fire the callback function in the then method. Now this callback function is going to take this as the data into it. So we can say data, and inside here do something. Now all I'm going to do is, instead of opening up the curly braces, do this on one line and say console.log the data that we get back. Okay, and then we can also attach a catch method. So let's format this a bit better. I'm going to go to a new line and then do the catch method below, so .catch as well, and this time we're going to catch any kind of error, and console.log the error, just in case there is an error when we make the request. Okay then, so I think that's all done. So now when we hear a submit event, prevent the default, get the city value, reset the form, then call update city with the city they type in. When we do that, we take in the city, then we get the city and store that in city details. That is the object about the city. Now on that is the key right here for that city. So now we say get weather to get the weather response, and we pass in that key. We store that response in the weather, and that is the weather object. Then finally we return a new object which contains two properties, one for the city details and one for the weather. So that's returned down here, and when this promise resolves, we fire this function and we take that data which is returned to us and we log it to the console. We also catch an error if there is one. So let me save this and preview. Now if I say Manchester and press enter, fingers crossed, this works, and we get now the city details and the weather. If I expand, we can see the city details are here, and the weather details are here. So now we have all that information, and if I type a new one, New York for example, then we get a new object. That is New York information and the weather in New York as well.